What does a man who has everything do when he feels he has nothing left to live for? For Quentin Aldridge, a man whose name was synonymous with unimaginable wealth, the answer was to disappear. He shed his tailored suits and his billion-dollar empire, trading them for a worn-out jacket and the anonymity of a forgotten coastal town. He was a ghost searching for a reason to exist, convinced the world was driven by greed. But in a greasy spoon diner, he was about to meet a young waitress, burdened by her own silent struggles, who would test his broken faith in humanity with a simple act of honesty, so profound it would bring the unbreakable tycoon to his knees, weeping. The man who called himself John arrived in Port Blossom the way the autumn fog rolled in off the Atlantic, silently and without notice. He stepped off a grimy bus that groaned to a stop in the town's deserted square, a single scuffed leather backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked like a man who had been worn down by the road, his face a roadmap of exhaustion, etched with lines of a sorrow too deep for his 40-something years. His grey-streaked hair was unkempt, his jacket was thin against the coastal chill, and his eyes, the only feature that hinted at a former fire, were vacant, scanning the sleepy town with a profound sense of detachment. This man was in another life, Quentin Aldridge. His real name was whispered in boardrooms from New York to Hong Kong. He was the architect of Aldridge Holdings, a colossal conglomerate with interests in global logistics and sustainable technology. He lived in a penthouse that pierced the Manhattan skyline, owned vineyards in France, and had the kind of wealth that could alter the fate of nations. But 1 year ago, on a rain-slicked highway in the Alps, that wealth had proven utterly worthless. It could not rewind time. It could not bring back his wife, Eleonora, whose laughter had been the entire symphony of his world. Since her death, Quentin had become a ghost in his own life. The world had turned grey, every deal a pointless distraction, every luxury a hollow echo of a life they were supposed to share. He saw avarice everywhere, in the sycophantic smiles of his executives, the grasping hands of distant relatives, and the feigned sympathy of a society that coveted his fortune. He began to believe that humanity was a transaction, a species motivated purely by self-interest. Eleonora, an artist who found beauty in the smallest, most overlooked things, had been the exception. With her gone, he was convinced the world was as bankrupt as his heart. So he vanished. He left his empire in the capable, if somewhat bewildered hands of his board, packed a bag with a few changes of clothes, a well-worn book of poetry Eleonora had loved, and enough cash to last a lifetime for most, but which he intended to use sparingly. He chose Port Blossom from a map, pointing a finger at a random speck on the Oregon coast, a place so insignificant it was unlikely anyone would ever look for him there. He wanted to prove his grim thesis that if you stripped away the pretense, everyone had a price. His first few days were a blur of solitary walks along the windswept beach, the cries of gulls mocking the silence in his soul. He stayed in a cheap motel where the wallpaper peeled and the air smelled of salt and mildew. He was just another piece of driftwood washed ashore. On the third day, a gnawing hunger drove him towards the town's only real eatery, a place called the Salty Spoon Diner. The sign, a cheerful blue spoon, was faded and chipped. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of fried bacon and old coffee. Red vinyl booths were cracked like ancient riverbeds, and the low hum of a refrigerator was the dominant sound. It was perfect. It was a place where no one would ever recognize Quentin Aldridge. He slid into a booth by the window, watching the grey waves crash onto the shore. A young woman approached his table, her movements efficient, yet tinged with weariness. She couldn't have been more than 23. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her uniform a pale yellow dress with a white apron, was immaculately clean, but frayed at the cuffs. What struck him were her eyes. They were a deep, thoughtful brown, but shadowed with a fatigue that went beyond a long shift. "Coffee," she asked, her voice soft, with a faint, unplaceable accent. "Please," he rasped, his own voice rusty from disuse. "Black." She returned with a steaming mug and a laminated menu, placing them on the table without fuss. "I'm Saskia. Let me know when you're ready." He watched her as she moved through the diner, refilling a fisherman's coffee, sharing a brief, kind word with an elderly couple wiping down the counter with practiced ease. There was a quiet dignity about her, a stark contrast to the performative service he was used to in five-star restaurants. This wasn't for a big tip, it was just her job. He ordered pancakes, which he barely touched. He was there to observe, to feel the gritty reality of a world he had long since left behind. He paid the modest bill in cash, leaving a standard tip, nothing more. As he stood up to leave, his hand brushed against the inside pocket of his jacket. He felt for the familiar bulge of his wallet, and finding it, turned and walked out into the biting wind, his collar pulled up against the cold. He walked for nearly an hour along the coast, the desolate beauty of the landscape, doing little to soothe the storm inside him. It wasn't until he reached the rocky cliffs at the edge of town that he decided to buy a bottle of water from a small general store. He reached into his pocket. It was empty. A cold dread entirely separate from his grief washed over him. It wasn't about the money. The wallet contained over $3,000 in cash, an emergency fund. But it also held the last photograph ever taken of Eleonora. It was a candid shot from their anniversary, her head thrown back in laughter, the sunlight catching the gold in her hair. It was the only tangible piece of her joy he had left. He had lost it, and he knew exactly where. Back at the Salty Spoon diner, on the cracked vinyl seat of that booth by the window. A bitter, cynical smile touched his lips. Of course. This was the test he hadn't even intended to set. $3,000. To a waitress in a town like this, a girl with tired eyes and a frayed uniform, that was a fortune. It was a winning lottery ticket. He was certain he knew how this story ended. She would find it, her eyes would widen, and the wallet would disappear forever. He would have his proof, cold and hard, that the world was exactly as he thought it was. And the last picture of his wife would be the price of that miserable confirmation. The lunch rush had subsided, leaving the Salty Spoon in a state of weary calm. Saskia Fernwood moved between the tables with an economy of motion born from years of practice. Her feet ached a dull throb that had become a familiar companion during her double shifts. As she cleared the last of the dirty plates from the booth by the window, her hand brushed against something hard, wedged between the seat and the backrest. She pulled it out. It was a men's wallet. It was made of rich, dark brown leather, so worn and supple it felt like silk. It was old and clearly well-loved, but she could tell it had once been expensive. There was no ostentatious logo, just the faint, faded initials, J.E.D., embossed in one corner. Her heart gave a little flutter of anxiety. Lost wallets were always a hassle. Usually they contained a driver's license and a few dollars, and the owner would return in a panic within the hour. She opened it, hoping to find an ID, so she could put a name to the sad, quiet man who had sat there. The first thing she saw was the cash, neat stacks of $100 bills. She quickly, almost fearfully, thumbed through them. She stopped counting when she passed 2,000. A dizzying wave of lightheadedness washed over her. It was more money than she had seen in one place in her entire life. It was more than 3 months of her salary, more than 2 semesters of tuition for the nursing program she dreamed of, more than enough to cover the next round of her mother's medication. Her mother. The thought brought a sharp, familiar pang to her chest. Anya Fernwood was thousands of miles away, in a small grey village in Eastern Europe, fighting a battle against a chronic illness that the local doctors had long given up on. Saskia sent almost every dollar she earned back home for treatments, for better food, for a sliver of hope. Just last night, her mother had called, her voice weak but trying to sound cheerful, telling Saskia not to worry, even as a racking cough punctuated her sentences. The specialist in the capital had recommended a new expensive drug, one that was completely out of their reach. Now a solution was sitting in her hands, a solution that smelled of leather and belonged to a stranger, a wave of temptation so powerful it made her sick to her stomach, crashed over her. She could take the cash and leave the wallet. The man didn't look like he was from around here. He was a tourist, a drifter. He'd be gone by tomorrow, and he'd just assume he'd been pickpocketed. Who would ever know? Find something good. Saskia jumped, snapping the wallet shut, as if it had burned her. Brenda, her co-worker, was leaning against the counter, a toothpick dangling from her lips, and a smirk playing on her face. Brenda was as sharp and jagged as Saskia was quiet and reserved. She had worked at the diner for 10 years and possessed a cynical worldview that she wore like armor. A customer left his wallet, Saskia said, her voice barely a whisper, as she tucked it into her apron pocket. Brenda's eyes glinted. "Oh yeah, anyone we know?" "No, a tourist, I think." The man in the corner booth, the sad-eyed fella, looked like he had the world on his shoulders. Brenda mused, wiping a glass with a dirty rag. "How much was in it? I didn't really look." Saskia lied the words, feeling like ash in her mouth. Brenda let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, please, don't give me that." Your hands were shaking. "Look, kid, let me give you some advice. This town is a dead end. People like us, we don't get lucky breaks. Sometimes you gotta make your own. A tourist loses his wallet. That's not a tragedy. It's a tip from the universe." Saskia felt a flush of anger and shame. "It's not my money. So what? He's probably some rich guy on a slumming vacation. That kind of cash is probably what he uses to light his cigars. To you, it's a lifeline. Think about it. That nursing school application you're always staring at." Your mum Brenda's voice softened with feigned sympathy. "The universe doesn't care about being fair, Saskia. You have to take what it gives you." Brenda's words echoed the darkest thoughts, swirling in Saskia's own mind. She pictured the pile of medical bills on her small kitchen table. She pictured the acceptance letter from the community college's nursing program, which she'd had to defer for the second time. Taking the money would solve everything. It would be so easy. She went into the small, cramped employee bathroom and locked the door. Her reflection in the cracked mirror showed a pale, frightened girl. She pulled the wallet out again, her fingers trembling. This time, as she opened it, a small photograph tucked behind a credit card slot slid out and fell into the sink. She picked it up. It was a picture of a woman with a radiant, joyful smile, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She was beautiful. The man from the booth was in the background, looking at the woman with an expression of such profound love and adoration that it stole Saskia's breath away. This wasn't just a wallet full of money. It was a life. It was a memory. Saskia thought of her own father, who had passed away when she was a teenager. The one small, faded photograph she had of him was her most precious possession. To lose it would be like losing him all over again. In that moment, the temptation vanished, replaced by a wave of empathy so intense it was almost painful. She imagined the quiet, sad man, his grief as palpable as the ocean mist outside. He had lost this woman, she was sure of it. And this picture, this wallet, was what he had left of her. The money meant nothing. The memory meant everything. She carefully slid the photograph back into its slot, her decision made. It wasn't even a choice anymore. It was a certainty. She tucked the wallet deep into her apron, the weight of it no longer a temptation, but a responsibility. She would put it in the diner's safe and wait for him to return. And if he didn't, she would take it to the police. She wouldn't let Brenda's poison or her own desperation tarnish this small, decent thing she could do. She would not become the kind of person the world seemed to want her to be. Quentin Aldridge walked back towards the Salty Spoon diner with a heavy, deliberate tread. Each step was a confirmation of his bleak philosophy. He felt a grim satisfaction, the kind a scientist feels when a dismal hypothesis is proven correct. He was already composing the narrative in his head. The waitress Saskia would deny ever seeing the wallet. Her face would be a mask of innocence, but her eyes would betray her. He would have his proof, and the loss of Eleonora's photograph would be a fittingly cruel punctuation to his experiment in human nature. He pushed open the diner door, the little bell above it, tinkling with a cheerfulness that felt like a personal insult. The place was mostly empty now, the air smelling of stale coffee and disinfectant. Saskia was at the far end of the counter, meticulously refilling salt and pepper shakers. She looked up as he entered, and her eyes widened, not with guilt, but with what looked like relief. "Hi," she said, her voice soft. "You're back." Quentin's guard was up. He approached the counter, his expression cold and accusatory. "I believe I left something here, in the booth by the window." He watched her closely, waiting for the flicker of denial, the subtle shift of a liar. Instead, her face broke into a genuine, tired smile. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said. She turned and walked to the small office behind the counter, disappearing for a moment. He heard the metallic click of a lockbox. She returned, holding the brown leather wallet. She held it out to him, her expression open and honest. "You're lucky I was the one who cleared your table. I put it away for you." Quentin stared at the wallet in her hand, then at her face. He was momentarily speechless. This was not how the scene was supposed to play out. He took the wallet, his fingers brushing hers. He felt an unexpected jolt, a flicker of human connection he hadn't felt in a year. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick. "You should check it," she prompted gently. "Make sure everything is there." He was almost afraid to. He opened it, his cynical heart still expecting a trick. He saw the neat stacks of $100 bills untouched. His thumb fumbled for the small photo slot. He pulled it out. There was Eleonora smiling at him, safe. A wave of emotion so powerful it almost buckled, his knees washed over him. He felt a prickling behind his eyes, an unfamiliar sting of tears he ruthlessly suppressed. He looked at Saskia, truly looked at her for the first time. He saw the deep-seated exhaustion in her eyes, the worn-down fabric of her uniform, the faint tremor in her hands that suggested she hadn't eaten a proper meal all day. And yet she had returned a sum of money that could have changed her life without a moment's hesitation. "It's all here," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He pulled out $200 bills. "Please, take this. For your trouble, for your honesty." He extended the money to her. To his utter astonishment, she took a small step back, shaking her head. A faint blush colored her cheeks. "I can't accept that," she said quietly but firmly. "I didn't do anything special. I just did what was right." "But this is a lot of money," Quentin insisted, bewildered. Surely you could use it. Everyone can use money, she replied, a hint of a sad smile on her lips. But my mother taught me that you don't get paid for being a decent human being. That's just the price of admission. I'm glad you got your wallet back. She turned back to her salt shakers, her message clear: the transaction was over. Quentin stood there frozen, the $200 bills clutched in his hand. He was completely disarmed. His entire framework for understanding the world had been shattered by a quiet waitress in a rundown diner. He had come to Port Blossom seeking confirmation of humanity's greed, and had instead found its opposite in the most unlikely of circumstances. He slid the money back into his wallet and sat down at the counter. "I'll have another coffee," he said. Saskia nodded, her professionalism returning, and poured him a fresh cup. The silence between them was no longer tense, but filled with a new, unspoken curiosity. Quentin didn't leave. He sat there for the next hour, nursing his coffee, a silent observer in the corner of Saskia's world. He watched her treat every customer with the same quiet grace. She helped an elderly man whose hands trembled with Parkinson's cut his food. She patiently tolerated a group of boisterous teenagers cleaning up their spilled soda without a word of complaint. He saw Brenda, the other waitress, snap at Saskia for being too slow, and saw Saskia absorb the criticism with a quiet, resilient dignity. He wasn't just observing a waitress anymore. He was studying a person of profound and unyielding character. He had built an empire by being an expert judge of people, by seeing their angles, their motivations, their price. But Saskia Fernwood didn't seem to have one. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. His grim experiment had failed spectacularly. But instead of disappointment, he felt a strange, unfamiliar flicker of light in the vast darkness of his grief. He decided in that moment that he wasn't leaving Port Blossom. Not yet. He needed to understand. He needed to know who this woman was, this anomaly, who had, with a simple act of integrity, questioned everything he thought he knew about the world and about himself. He would stay, not as Quentin Aldridge, the billionaire, but as John the Drifter. He would become a regular at the Salty Spoon, and he would unravel the mystery of Saskia Fernwood. Over the next 2 weeks, John became a fixture at the Salty Spoon diner. He took the same booth by the window every morning, ordering black coffee and toast he rarely finished. He became part of the diner's quiet rhythm, a silent observer the regulars quickly grew accustomed to. He spoke little, but he watched everything, and his focus was almost entirely on Saskia. He learned her schedule, the morning shifts on weekdays, the grueling double on Saturdays. He saw the subtle signs of her struggle that he, in his previous life, would have been blind to. He noticed she never ate during her shifts, only sipping water from a plastic bottle she refilled in the back. He saw the cheap, worn-out sneakers she wore, the soles separating from the canvas. He saw her studying from a thick textbook with a title like Anatomy and Physiology during her short 10-minute breaks, her brow furrowed in concentration. Slowly, carefully, he began to draw her out. It started with simple questions. "Busy day?" he'd ask. Always she'd reply with a small, tired smile. Gradually their conversations lengthened. He learned her last name was Fernwood. He learned about the nursing program at the Coastal Community College, the one she desperately wanted to attend. "I've always wanted to help people," she told him, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, as she refilled his coffee for the 3rd time. "My mother. She was always sick when I was growing up. The nurses were like angels to me. They didn't just give her medicine. They gave her kindness. I want to be that for someone else." "What's stopping you?" Quentin asked, his voice gentle. A shadow passed over her face. "Life, I guess. It's expensive, and I have responsibilities. He didn't push, but he filed the information away. He started leaving larger tips, not so large as to be suspicious or insulting, but enough to make a difference. A $10 bill for a $2 coffee. He noticed she would always look at it, a brief flash of surprise in her eyes, before pocketing it with a quiet, "Thank you." He knew from watching her that the money wasn't going towards a new pair of shoes or a night out. It was going into an envelope she kept in her locker, the one marked Mama. One Saturday the diner was slammed. A tour bus had broken down, and the place was flooded with irritable tourists. Saskia was a blur of motion, flying between tables, her face flushed with exertion. Brenda was complaining loudly, making the tense atmosphere even worse. Quentin watched as a particularly demanding family ran Saskia ragged, sending back food, demanding endless refills, and treating her not as a person, but as a function. When they finally left, they threw a few crumpled $1 bills on the table, a pathetic tip for an hour of torment. As Saskia cleared the table, her shoulders slumped. Quentin saw her composure crack for just a second. A single tear traced a path down her cheek before she hastily wiped it away, her back to the room. The sight ignited a protective fury in Quentin he hadn't felt in years. It was the same anger he used to feel when a competitor tried to undermine his company, but this was purer, more personal. He wanted to storm over to that family's bus and decry their callousness. He wanted to buy the entire diner and fire Brenda on the spot. He wanted to hand Saskia a blank check and tell her to go to the best nursing school in the country, but he was John the Drifter, so he stayed put. Later, when the chaos had subsided, he called her over. "You handle yourself with a lot of grace, Saskia," he said, his voice low and sincere. She looked surprised, as if she wasn't used to being seen. "It's part of the job." "No," he insisted. "It's part of who you are." A real smile, the first he had ever seen from her, that reached her eyes, transformed her face. "Thank you. My father used to say that dignity is the one thing no one can take from you unless you give it away." That evening, Quentin did something he hadn't done since Eleonora died. He made a call. He dialed the number of his private wealth manager, a man named Mr. Peterson, who was one of the few people who knew he wasn't on a remote meditation retreat. "Peterson," he said, his voice crisp and authoritative, the voice of Quentin Aldridge returning for a moment. "I need you to do something for me. Off the books. Utmost discretion. Of course, Mr. Aldridge, whatever you need. I want you to research medical facilities. The absolute best in the world for treating advanced rheumatoid arthritis and associated pulmonary complications. I'm thinking Johns Hopkins Mayo Clinic, maybe a specialist clinic in Switzerland. Get me a full report on treatments, costs, and logistics for patient transport. And Peterson, money is not an object. May I ask for whom this is, sir?" "Just get me the information," Quentin commanded, before softening his tone. "It's for a friend." He hung up the phone, the salty night air, feeling sharp and clean in his lungs. He was no longer just an observer. He was starting to feel the pull of his old life, not the power or the wealth, but the ability that came with it. The ability to intervene, the ability to change a life. For a year he had been paralyzed by what he couldn't do, save his wife. Now he was starting to see what he could do, and it was all because of the quiet waitress who believed that dignity was something you kept and that doing the right thing was its own reward. He was beginning to believe it too. The breaking point came on a miserable rain-swept Thursday. The diner was nearly empty, the weather keeping even the most loyal regulars at bay. Mr. Gable, the owner, a perpetually stressed man with a kind heart buried under a mountain of bills, was in his office going over the bleak weekly earnings. Quentin sat in his usual booth, the diner's oppressive quiet, amplifying the tension that had been simmering for weeks between Saskia and Brenda. Brenda had grown increasingly resentful of the quiet man who sat in Saskia's section, day after day leaving tips that were larger than Brenda's own hourly wage. She saw Saskia's quiet integrity not as a virtue, but as a sanctimonious act, a silent judgment on her own cynical worldview. Today she decided to act on that resentment. The setup was cruelly simple. At the end of her shift, Brenda went to Mr. Gable's office, her face a mask of concern. "Mr. Gable, I don't want to cause trouble," she began, her voice dripping with false sincerity. "But I'm worried about the till. It's been short a few times this month on Saskia's shifts, just $20 or $30 here and there. I didn't want to say anything, but today. It's short $100. Mr. Gable's face, already creased with worry, darkened. $100 was a significant loss for a small business barely staying afloat. "Are you sure Brenda counted yourself?" she said, gesturing towards the cash register. She was the only one on it for the last hour. What Brenda didn't mention was the $100 bill she had deftly palmed from the register, while Saskia was in the back restocking napkins. She had tucked it deep into the pocket of her own coat. Mr. Gable came out of the office, his expression grim. "Saskia, can I have a word?" Saskia, who was wiping down the last table, looked up, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Of course, Mr. Gable." Quentin watched from his booth, every nerve on high alert. He saw Brenda lingering by the kitchen door, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "The till is $100 short from your shift," Mr. Gable said bluntly, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Do you know anything about that?" Saskia's face went pale. "What? No, I don't understand. I cashed out everyone properly." "Brenda says it's been happening for a while," Mr. Gable pressed, clearly hating the confrontation. "Small amounts. Now this." "That's not true." Saskia's voice trembled, a mixture of shock and hurt. "I would never—" "Mr. Gable, you know me." "I thought I did," he said, his gaze falling. "Look, Saskia, I have to ask. Can I see your bag?" The humiliation of the request was a physical blow. Saskia looked as though she had been struck. Her eyes darted around the empty diner, finally landing on Quentin. He saw in them a desperate plea for someone to believe her. Without a second thought, he stood up and walked over. "There seems to be a misunderstanding," Mr. Gable Quentin said, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that made both Mr. Gable and Brenda look at him in surprise. "This is an employee matter," John, Mr. Gable said, flustered. "This young woman has been serving me coffee every day for weeks." Quentin continued, his eyes fixed on Saskia's accuser. "Her character is impeccable. Before you accuse her, perhaps you should consider all the possibilities." He turned his gaze to Brenda. "Brenda, you were here too, weren't you? Maybe you miscounted." Brenda bristled. "I've been working here 10 years, I know how to count. The money's gone, and she was the last one on the register." "It's simple." "It's too simple," Quentin countered. "It's a setup." "A setup? Why would I do that?" Brenda scoffed, but a flicker of panic crossed her face. "I don't know. Jealousy, spite." Quentin took a step closer to her. "Mr. Gable, you have security cameras, don't you?" The color drained from Brenda's face. The diner's single dusty security camera was old and barely worked, a fact she had been counting on. But the bluff in Quentin's voice was potent. Mr. Gable hesitated. "It only covers the front door." "But it would show who came in and out of the office where the till is kept, wouldn't it?" Quentin pressed. "It would show everyone's movements." Saskia stood by, silent tears welling in her eyes. She wasn't crying from fear of being fired, but from the raw pain of betrayal and false accusation. Her quiet dignity, the one thing she cherished, was being stripped from her in this greasy, empty diner. She looked so small, so utterly alone, fighting a battle against a world that was determined to crush her spirit. And in that moment, Quentin Aldridge finally broke. The image of Saskia's tear-streaked face, her struggle to maintain her composure against a tide of injustice, superimposed itself over the memory of Eleonora in her final weeks, fighting her illness with a fierce, quiet grace that never wavered. His wife had never complained, never railed against the unfairness of it all. She had simply been dignified. And here was that same spirit, that same incredible strength in a young waitress he barely knew. The cynicism he had cultivated for a year, the wall he had built around his heart, crumbled into dust. An overwhelming surge of grief for his wife, of shame for his own jaded worldview, and of profound, aching empathy for Saskia crashed over him. He turned away from the others facing the window that looked out onto the rain-lashed street. His shoulders began to shake. A sob raw and guttural escaped his throat. He covered his face with his hands as the tears he had held back for a year finally came hot and unstoppable. He wept for Eleonora. He wept for the goodness he thought was gone from the world. And he wept for Saskia, whose simple, unwavering honesty had just saved him from himself. The diner fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of a billionaire disguised as a drifter crying his heart out. The following morning, the sun broke through the clouds, washing Port Blossom in a clean, crisp light. The aftermath of the previous day's confrontation hung heavy in the salty spoon. Mr. Gable, shaken by Quentin's emotional breakdown and his own doubts, had sent both Saskia and Brenda home, telling them he needed to figure things out. Saskia had spent a sleepless night, the accusation replaying in her mind, feeling as if her world was on the verge of collapsing. At precisely 10:00 a.m., a sleek black sedan, the kind of car Port Blossom only ever saw in movies, purred to a stop in front of the diner. A chauffeur in a dark suit opened the rear door. The man who stepped out was not John the weary drifter. This man was Quentin Aldridge. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal grey suit that probably cost more than the diner's monthly revenue. His hair was impeccably styled, and his shoes gleamed with a polish that reflected the morning sun. His face was clean-shaven, revealing a strong jawline, and the vacant, sorrowful look in his eyes had been replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He was accompanied by a severe-looking man in his late 50s, carrying a leather briefcase, Mr. Peterson. They entered the diner. Mr. Gable was behind the counter looking stressed. Brenda was there, having come in early to cement her story. Saskia was also there, summoned by Mr. Gable, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed, ready to plead her case one last time. All three of them stared, dumbfounded, at the man who had been their quiet, sad-eyed regular. Mr. Gable stammered, wiping his hands on his apron. What is all this? Brenda's jaw was slack with disbelief. This was not the homeless man she'd imagined. Quentin's eyes scanned the room, bypassing the others and landing on Saskia. His gaze was soft and filled with an emotion she couldn't decipher. "My name is not John," he said, his voice the same, yet completely different. It held a resonance of power and command that filled the small space. "It is Quentin Aldridge." The name meant nothing to them, but the presence, the suit, the car. It all spoke a language they understood perfectly: money and power. Mr. Peterson stepped forward and opened his briefcase on the counter. "Mr. Aldridge is the founder and CEO of Aldridge Holdings," he announced in a clipped, formal tone. Quentin walked calmly to the counter. He looked at Brenda, his expression unreadable. "Brenda, I believe you are owed $100. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp bill, placing it on the counter. "There, you can have it." Because it will be the last dollar you ever steal from a place of work." He then turned to Mr. Peterson. The footage from the discreet surveillance device I had installed in my rental car, which was parked across the street for the last 2 weeks, has been sent to the local police department. It clearly shows Brenda pocketing the money from the till yesterday afternoon. They should be arriving shortly. Brenda's face turned a blotchy, terrified white. You can't. It was a mistake." "A joke, fraud, and slander are not jokes," Quentin said coldly. "You tried to ruin an innocent person's life out of petty jealousy. You will face the consequences." As if on cue, the distant wail of a siren could be heard approaching. Brenda began to sob, her cynical facade crumbling into pathetic fear. Quentin turned his attention to Mr. Gable, whose face was a mixture of awe and terror. "Mr. Gable, you run a business on thin margins. You were stressed, and you made a poor judgment call." "I understand. In fact, I'd like to help." Mr. Peterson slid a folder across the counter. "Mr. Aldridge has drafted a proposal," he explained. "An interest-free business improvement loan of $250,000 to renovate the diner, upgrade the kitchen, and give your employees a raise and health benefits. The only condition is that you offer Saskia Fernwood the position of general manager with a commensurate salary effective immediately." Mr. Gable stared at the documents, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. He looked from the papers to Quentin, to Saskia, his mind unable to process the sudden, seismic shift in his reality. Finally, Quentin walked over to Saskia, who had been standing by her table frozen in shock, her mind reeling. He stood before her, not as a powerful billionaire, but as the man who had wept in front of her. "Saskia," he began, his voice losing its boardroom edge and becoming gentle again. "For the past year I have been lost. I lost my wife, and with her I lost my faith in everything. I came to this town to prove to myself that the world was as dark and as greedy as I felt. I wanted to believe that everyone had a price." He reached out and gently took her hand. It was trembling. "And then I met you." He continued, his voice thick with emotion. "You who have every reason to be bitter, every excuse to be selfish. You struggled to pay for nursing school and to care for your sick mother thousands of miles away. You found a wallet with enough money to solve so many of your problems, and you returned it. You refused a reward. You endured cruelty and false accusations with a dignity that reminded me of the best person I ever knew." Tears welled in his eyes again, but this time they were not tears of grief but of gratitude. "You didn't just return my wallet, Saskia. You returned my hope. You showed me that character isn't about what you do when people are watching, but what you do when you think no one is. You saved me from my own bitterness." He let go of her hand and gestured to Mr. Peterson, who produced another more ornate folder. "This is not a reward," Quentin said, his voice firm. "A reward is for a transaction. This is an investment in goodness." Saskia opened the folder with trembling fingers. Inside were documents that made her gasp. A full paid-in-full scholarship to the prestigious Johns Hopkins School of Nursing. A deed to a fully furnished condominium near the campus in Baltimore. And flight itineraries and medical admission forms for her mother, Anya Fernwood, to be flown by private medical transport to the Johns Hopkins Hospital, to be treated by the world's leading specialists in her field, with all expenses covered for as long as it takes. The world swam before Saskia's eyes. She looked from the life-altering papers to the man standing before her. He wasn't a billionaire or a drifter. He was a man with a broken heart, and somehow, through a simple act of honesty, she had helped to mend it. And in doing so, he was giving her the world. The tears she had held back finally fell not of sorrow or humiliation, but of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. The transformation that swept through Port Blossom in the wake of Quentin Aldridge's revelation was less like a change and more like a tidal shift, altering the landscape of several lives in a single powerful surge. For Saskia, the first few days were a disorienting dream. She would wake up in her small, familiar apartment, and for a moment, the weight of her double shifts and the gnawing anxiety for her mother would settle upon her, only to be lifted by the surreal memory of a man in a bespoke suit, a fleet of lawyers, and a future she'd never dared to imagine. The town buzzed with the story. She became a local legend, overnight the honest waitress who had brought a billionaire to tears. Brenda vanished from town, a ghost of her own, making, swallowed by the legal consequences Quentin's formidable team had set in motion. Mr. Gable, meanwhile, walked around his diner with the dazed, beatific smile of a man who had been granted a reprieve from the gallows. He looked at Saskia not just with respect, but with a kind of reverent awe. The first thing he did, even before the architects arrived, was hand her a key to the diner. "It's your ship to steer, Saskia," he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. "At least until your real journey begins." That journey began a week later, on a crisp, clear morning, at a private airfield a few miles down the coast. Saskia stood on the tarmac, her hand clutching Quentin's arm, her knuckles white. She had never been this close to such a machine, a gleaming white medical jet that seemed to have descended from another reality. Every part of her trembled with a hope so fierce it was painful. Quentin stood silently beside her, a bastion of calm. He wasn't her benefactor in that moment, or a billionaire. He was just a friend sharing the vigil. When the jet's door opened and the stairs descended, Saskia's breath caught in her throat. A team of paramedics emerged, and between them, carefully supported, was a frail woman with silver-streaked hair and eyes that held the same deep, soulful brown as her daughter's. Anya Fernwood looked out at the strange new world, her expression a mixture of fear and profound confusion, until her gaze found Saskia. Time seemed to stop. Saskia let go of Quentin's arm and ran her feet pounding against the tarmac. "Mama!" she cried the single word, carrying a lifetime of love worry and distance. Their reunion was a storm of tears and whispered words in their native tongue, a language of home and heart that Quentin could not understand but felt in his very soul. He watched as Saskia held her mother, stroking her hair, wiping her tears. Her face radiant with a joy so pure it was almost blinding. Anya clutched her daughter's arms, her gaze shifting to the tall, powerfully dressed man, standing a respectful distance away. Her questioning eyes asked what her words couldn't. Saskia turned her own eyes, shining with tears, and pulled Quentin closer. "This is Quentin," she said, switching to English so he would understand the weight of her words. "He is a good man, Mama. An angel." Quentin felt a warmth spread through his chest, chasing away the last, lingering shadows of his year-long winter. He simply nodded at Anya, a quiet smile on his face. This was it. This was the feeling he had been chasing. Not power, not profit, but the tangible, world-altering impact of a single focused act of goodness. This reunion, this raw, unfiltered love felt more real and more valuable than any billion-dollar merger he had ever orchestrated. Before she left for Baltimore, Quentin sat with Saskia in the newly emptied diner, the air filled with the scent of sawdust and the promise of renewal. He explained his plans for the Eleonora Foundation, a charitable trust he was creating. "I'm naming it for my wife," he said, his voice low. "For a year, I thought her legacy was just my grief. But you showed me that's not true. Eleonora believed that beauty and goodness were hidden everywhere in the most overlooked places. She would have loved you, Saskia. He told her that her scholarship and her mother's care would be the Foundation's first official acts, cementing her not as a recipient of charity, but as the inspiration for its very existence. Saskia's life at Johns Hopkins was a world away from Port Blossom. She traded her frayed apron for crisp blue scrubs, the clatter of plates for the steady beeping of heart monitors. The exhaustion was still there, but it was the fulfilling ache of purpose, not the draining fatigue of survival. Her innate empathy, honed by a life of hardship, made her a natural healer. She visited her mother every day, watching with overwhelming gratitude as the world's best medicine, coupled with the simple peace of knowing her daughter was safe, began to work its magic. Anya's strength slowly returned the light in her eyes, burning a little brighter each day. Quentin returned to his empire in New York, but he was not the same man who had left it. The ghost was gone. In its place was a leader with a renewed mission. His board was stunned when he began systematically reallocating capital-pivoting Aldridge holdings away from profit-at-all-costs ventures and towards sustainable ethical and philanthropic investments. He still missed Eleonora with a profound ache, but the pain was no longer a barren wasteland. It was now a fertile ground from which a new purpose could grow. He and Saskia spoke weekly, their conversations a touchstone for them both, a quiet waitress from a forgotten town, and a titan of industry bound by an unlikely friendship that had redefined both their lives. A year to the day after Quentin had revealed himself, Saskia walked the sterile, hopeful halls of the hospital, her stride confident, her posture radiating a calm professionalism. She was on her way to meet her mother, who was now in outpatient care and strong enough to take walks in the hospital garden. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Quentin. There was no text, only a single image. It was a photo of the diner in Port Blossom, gleaming with new paint and a wide, welcoming front porch. But it was the sign that made her stop in the middle of the hallway. The old faded salty spoon was gone. In its place was a beautiful hand-carved wooden sign painted in soft blues and whites. It read, "Eleonora's Spoon." Tears welled in Saskia's eyes. It wasn't about a rich man saving a poor girl. It never had been. It was about two broken people who, through a chance encounter over a lost wallet, had managed to save each other. He had given her a future free from worry, but she had given him something far more precious, a way to turn his unending grief into a living tribute of love and light. In the quiet, unyielding currency of kindness, they had both found their fortune. In a world that so often measures a person's worth by the size of their bank account, the story of Quentin and Saskia is a powerful testament to a different kind of wealth. It's the story of how one small, honest act can ripple outwards, mending a shattered heart, rewriting futures and reminding us all that true value lies not in what we possess, but in what we are willing to give of ourselves. Saskia's integrity, offered freely in a moment of great personal need, became the catalyst that transformed a billionaire's cynical grief into a legacy of hope. It proves that the greatest poverty is a lack of compassion, and the greatest fortune is a character that cannot be bought. If this story of unexpected grace and the profound power of simple honesty touched your heart, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the goodness in the world, and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the depths of the human spirit. What would you have done in Saskia's position? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for listening.